So I'm Rebecca Raimow. I'm an archivist at WGBH, and this is Dave Rice, who is not only an archivist, audiovisual archivist at CUNY TV, but has had his hands in most of the most interesting open source tool projects for the audiovisual digitization process that have come out over the past 10 years or more, including QC tools, which is one of the things that we're going to be playing with today. You guys should all have a thumb drive that has the QC tool software on it and some sample files to play with. Dave pretty much developed that tool mostly by himself. Not by himself, with a lot of other people. And has done a lot to try and make it easier for people who are working in small archives or archives that don't necessarily have a lot of institutional support for audiovisual preservation, to make it easier for people working with those collections to get a handle on their audiovisual materials. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, good introduction. Hey everybody, what's up? It's nice to be here at Simmons. I guess to introduce me a little bit more as far as like where I'm coming from to get into this project and this subject, I did like get into Simmons, but like I withdrew like near the beginning before classes started, so I wouldn't have to pay because I started having doubts. But there was like, back then there was a rumor that there was going to be this school that was going to be 1 year at NYU and 1 year at the Selznick School in Rochester, but it was like canceled after I moved to New York. I just chilled in New York for a year, and then I went to the Selznick School of Film Preservation in Rochester. But like the reason I kind of bring up that school and that education in this subject is that like the Selznick School of Film Preservation is at an active archive, like one of the 3 largest film archives in the country, I think. And it's a school that teaches you just like all aspects of the technical control of film preservation to a very granular degree. Like you get the chemistry, the optics, like you know, all the like the film handling, projection. So as far as like taking a decaying or film print and moving it through all the steps of preservation, like you get a very comprehensive sense of all those aspects. When I got out of school, my first job was as an archivist at Democracy Now!, like this daily news program in New York. And they didn't have any like film, but I still had to be the archivist. And that was the only format I really knew how to work with. And at Democracy Now! It was all like digital, and I didn't learn about that at all. And it was mostly digital tapes. Like not like there is one like body of expertise and knowledge about preservation of digital files, and then there's like kind of this other body of knowledge about the preservation and digitization of analog media. But there wasn't a whole lot of information on like what do you do with like these digital tapes, like DAT tapes and mini DV tapes, like from that kind of transitional era. I mean, from the Selznick School, I knew what it felt like to know what I'm doing, but like when I was actually had a job, I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. So it kind of gave me a sense to know like how bad I was doing and how much progress I had to make. But like one kind of analogy that stuck with me early in trying to work with digital materials, digital audiovisual materials, was that like in a film archive, like the way you interact with the film images is very different based on if you're like interacting with that on a projection screen, like seeing the result of how a player, like a film projector, like renders that image on a screen and what it looks like what you can tell about the film by the way it moves through the gate, the way it shows to an audience. That experience of interacting with a film like that is a bit indirect because you're not actually looking at the film at all. You're just looking at the image, some image on a screen in a different room from where the projector typically is. Like that experience and that interaction with the audiovisual format is very distinct from like when you work on it on like a film bench, like a technical bench where you take the reel of film, put it on, you like unspool it, wind it up on another one. Like you can get your hands into the splices, the edge damage. You can like measure the shrinkage of the film, see how brittle it is, like where it's damaged. You can interact with it in so many ways that you wouldn't be able to by just sitting in the audience and trying to see the projected image. So like, you know, the way you can potentially repair or diagnose a film is really different depending on like which one of those 2 interactions you're taking. But then with digital media, I realized like, for the most part, I was only working with like the equivalent of like the projection, like seeing like, what does this video look like when I put it into QuickTime Player or VLC? and I'm not having that film bench experience with audiovisual data at all. So the first type of audiovisual data I really started working with in detail was DV, from like mini DV tapes and stuff. It ends up being like a very kind of like film-like codec, because every frame is like the same size. The placement spatially of like what data is audio and what data is video all kind of has the same pattern from like frame to frame. But it's a lot of information. It's like 1,200 bytes per frame. So I ended up getting like the DV specification and like cross-referencing it between the data and the specification that defined it, and eventually started to like understand better. And then eventually got to a place where I was like, oh, if instead of just like staring at the computer all day, like I could get the IT guy I work with to like write a script to like look for certain patterns or diagnose certain things about the video. You know, going from there, I started realizing like digital audiovisual archivists often just kind of borrow tools from related communities and adapt them for our use. So like in a lot of audiovisual archive environments, like we're working with tools that came from like editing environments or broadcast environments, like things that are set up to do quality control or audiovisual processing related to their needs. You know, but there hasn't been a whole lot of software development specifically for audiovisual preservation, because it's like a much smaller community. Like Apple's not going to have like an iMovie for archivists, you know, that's going to like do what we want. But so, you know, so as I started moving along in my career, people would be like, hey, let's write a grant. So like, you know, we'd write a grant, we'd get rejected, we'd feel bummed, and they'd be like, you guys should apply next year though, your idea is really cool. And then we'd do that, like they said, and we'd get rejected again. And we'd be like, are you guys just being like fake polite, or do you mean it? And then like, the third time, they were like, oh yeah, now you have like a lot of money to do software development. And we're like, cool. So that's how like the QC Tools project started. It was like the third time we applied for something. It was me, Angelo Sacerdote at Bay Area Video Coalition, and Skip Elsheimer at AV Geeks. Like we had a panel at AMIA way back when, where we were just like complaining about all these problems of audiovisual digitization, and just kind of imagining that maybe there'd be a better way, so we can find out how bad our work is specifically, rather than just guessing how bad our work is. So before delving into quality control too much, I want to go through this slideshow about audiovisual digitization, just because it kind of goes over some of the basic components of what is going on in audiovisual digitization, because a lot of the problems and things to worry about and paranoia and self-doubt kind of come from different components of the digitization process. Let's skip over this because I'm going to do the abbreviated version here. But you know, there's generally this common idea amongst audiovisual archivists that like we need to start being like really worried and paranoid because we have all this analog audiovisual media from decades, but nobody's using this anymore to record onto. So, you know, the companies that create audiovisual players, they don't want to make any more video players anymore for like Betacam or U-matic tapes because they're done. They're moved on to other things. So audiovisual archives that have like tens of thousands of tapes like this are dependent on technology that's not sold or maintained anymore. Degradescence is this kind of concept of obsolescence and degradation being combined into one word. So this is like Siobhan Hagen. She was like in 2014 at one of Mike Casey's presentations, and he was saying that degradescence means that most audiovisual media is going to be, you know, kind of obsolete or inaccessible by the year 2028. And then next year's student Nathan, he saw another repeat of Mike Casey's presentation about degradescence, and he says it's fun to say, but it means that analog video could be unusable by 2027. So I know there's like this trend here, like it went down from 2028 to 2027, and then later it's another presentation about the same issue. Sally is saying like all tape-based formats created in the 20th century are now obsolete. Tape that's not digitized by 2025 will in most cases be lost forever. Deadline's 2025. It's not 2028 anymore. Just letting you guys know. You know, have your New Year's Eve party 2024 while you're playing a U-matic tape, and you'll see what happens. When I started pointing this out on Twitter, like the trends that this is getting earlier than like John Fink was like setting it to say degradescence now. you know, but whether it's happening in 2025 or it's already happening, like, you know, it's a big issue. Like, we need this hardware, we need this expertise to maintain this hardware, the skills to use it, and we need to, like, you know, digitize or reformat this material if we're going to save this material. So generally, when you're setting up a project like this, you got to head over to eBay, and then if you work at a university or a large government organization, you have to, like, you know, somehow explain to the business office why you're trying to make a purchase order for something on eBay when they're like, well, just buy it new. Why are you on eBay? And I'm like, you can't buy this stuff new anymore. And then also you can see, like, there's no sense to the prices. You know, like the $2,000 UMAC deck might be broken and the $2,500 one might be fine. Like, when you're really desperate to acquire this material because your, like, precious UMATIC collections are deteriorating, you can find a lot of comfort by reading the descriptions of these decks to get phrases like, they seem to be in good physical condition, but I don't know how to test them. It tests, it powers on, and accepts and ejects a tape, you know, and that's about all the comfort you're going to get. But you know, in addition to trying to, like, get some of these before they hit the trash, we need to know how to use them. So, like, you know, a lot of the programs we have that teach audiovisual preservation are kind of scrambling to pass along this knowledge as far as, like, how to clean, maintain, how to fix this stuff. Right now at the City University where I work, City University of New York where I work, we have, like, one of the component boards for one of our decks, like, these little, like, slotted things in here is broken. So we're trying to go through the circuit board to find out, like, where it's failing, like the little test meter, trying to test the power at different points to repair it, because, like, you can't get a new one. You have to fix what you have, or, you know, head back to eBay or, you know, dumpster dive to try to collect this stuff.
It's good times when you're trying to teach a workshop and you realize that the one Betacam deck that you have to test people on has broken overnight, and you can't fix it, and you're on eBay looking for ones with a driving systems that that maybe are gonna work.
Yeah, I remember I got on Craigslist one day because I wanted to build, like, a film rewind station. You know, just so I can put, like, a reel of film on and then, like, crank it to the other side, spool it across. So I found some guy selling it, and when I went over there, he was like a production house, like, to do video editing, and he just, like, had the stuff, like, that had been in the back room for probably, like, 40 years, and he hadn't been using it, so he sold it to me. And he had, like, 2 UMATIC decks chilling on a shelf, and I was like, well, what's up with these? Are you selling these too? And he's like, no, I'm gonna bring them to Best Buy Recycling tomorrow. And I was like, can I just have these too? And so then I got those free side UMATIC decks with my film rewinds. Around the same time, like, I was walking, like, it's just like a 1-block walk for me from where I work to the subway. And when I was on my way, I saw, like, a very familiar looking corner of hardware poking out of a dumpster, and found, like, a UMATIC deck that was fine. It just needed, like, one connector on the back, like, soldered into place because it got knocked out because of probably being thrown into a dumpster. But then we had, like, another UMATIC deck. And we had, like, at work, we probably have, like, 8,000 of these tapes. So, like, we need to maintain the way to access them. Then a few days later, I was, like, walking by the same dumpster, and then it's just filled with, like, hundreds of UMATIC tapes, like, everything from, like, this ad agency or something in Midtown Manhattan that they were just, like, throwing away. And I did not dumpster dive for that. It's just gone. I want to say another thing that comes up with digitization is, like, typically, you know, audiovisual collections as they're stored might look like this, where all the formats are just kind of interleaved. This is, like, a mix of digibeta tapes, UMATIC, Betacam, just, like, all mixed up. I want to say, like, because, like, we're, like, at CUNY, we're planning to digitize it all. We ended up, like, moving it all into boxes where the box is sized for a particular combination of format and size. You know, so the boxes look like this, and then we know we can get on Uline, get a box that's, like, 14 by 12 by 9 or something, and that holds, like, 14 Betacam SX yellow tapes like this exactly. So for the most part, as we're moving stuff to digitization, it's, like, box by box. And the reason we do that is because, like, different tapes have different characteristics, and that affects how we digitize them. Like, some tapes have, like, 2 channels of audio, like left and right, and some have, like, 8 or 16. You know, so some have different video characteristics. So rather than having the poor person digitizing having to switch from, like, one set of characteristics to the next as they're going from tape to tape, we have everything kind of boxed up and very homogeneous, you know, so that they can just set it to a particular set of settings for Betacam SX, and then just, like, get all those boxes through and then move on to the next format. And then we call our offsite storage company after they're digitized, and they back the truck in, and they just take the boxes off to New Jersey, where it's way cheaper to store than in Manhattan. You know, it's like some people would be like, oh, after you digitize it, you can, like, throw it away. because that'll save some space. And like a good compromise is like to send it to New Jersey where it's just cheaper, you know, because it's like better than throwing it away, but you're not like filling Midtown Manhattan with like 40-year-old tape. This is just like what it looked like when I started working there. And that's my reaction when I saw it. Yeah, so like when you build a digitization station, like generally you need like something that's gonna connect to your video player and then to a computer that's going to receive the signal. So you need like a piece of hardware that's going to bridge from like this old obsolete equipment into your you know, newer computer that's going to receive the work. So this is like probably like under $100, this like Elgato capture system. It's meant to be like plugged into your VCR, and then it plugs into your laptop, and it just makes you like an H.264 file suitable to sending to YouTube. So like when people walk in and they're like, hey, I need to digitize all my home VHS, I'm like, I tell them to get like this. But like when I want to digitize like a professional at work, I build something like this. So it's more expensive than $100, but this is like a combination of like calibration tools, quality control tools, and hardware. So at the bottom right, you can see like there's a VHS deck. Above it are tools called time-based correctors that help you like make adjustments to the signal and correct the signal. And then there's over here these tools like called waveform monitors and vector scopes. These are tools that help you like calibrate the presentation coming from the video deck to the right brightness and to the right color. And then there's a monitor on top to help you see it, and a computer over here to capture everything. So this is kind of another version of the same thing. This is me at home trying to test something using a digibeta deck. So like that's a digibeta deck on the left. It plays out a signal that's already in digital form. And then from there, it's connecting into that like silver box in the middle. And that converts it into a signal that can go to the laptop, which is recording it in software. So generally, like when you set up a station like this, it's going to depend on like what tape formats you want to support. And typically, it'll be a very mixed environment. So like this is MePops, like at the Seattle City Hall. It's a combination of VHS decks, Betacams, U-Matics. These playback decks then go to time-based correctors that stabilize the signal, let you calibrate light and color, and then go to a computer where it's digitized. So that's like the gist on like what a digitization station looks like. If I remember right, you guys have like a digitization station here for video, right? How's it going? Does it work? You guys.
There's been a lot of turnover.
Nice.
In terms of people that have been on the AMIA computer, so we're gonna ask for Rebecca's help. Yeah, we're gonna get it working.
Well, at least there's this stuff. Yeah. Okay. This is kind of a picture, like at work, this is the computer side of things. We end up having like a triplet of these devices where it's like a Mac Mini, a G drive to receive all the digitized media, and then a Blackmagic card that is basically the bridge between like the video decks and the computer. We have a bunch of these like connected into like a switch, so we can have like one monitor and keyboard connected to multiple computers, and then there's a switch that like connects the monitor and keyboard to different computers, so that like one station can end up like running multiple machines. So this is kind of what it looks like where I work. It always looks like messy and ugly when you show it, but like when you're trying to use it, it's like, oh, this is actually like functions okay, you know. So something I wanted to show about the inside of the video decks that's going to come up later is how the deck is reading the tape. So if you pry the lid off of a video deck, like over here on the left, there's like an elevator. So like the tape goes in here and that goes down into its seated position. And then there are these like pins on these little tracks that like scoop under the tape and like pull it around this round head here. So this is a picture of like, here's like probably U-Matic tape like rolling around this drum of a head. Inside the head, there's these little readers that like read the tape as like a wide diagonal line going across to read the video and audio information. And on the top of the drum, you can see that there's two sets of wires coming out here, and then there's two on the other side. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. So these are connected to readers that are reading different components of the data. But generally, like the videotape, it's storing 2 half-height images per frame. So it'll store like one half-height picture and then another one, And then they are intended to be like interleaved or zippered together to show the full frame. So there'll be like one image that is just the odd lines followed by an image that's just the even lines. And then they're like interleaved together to make one single image. And that's because back in the day, it couldn't read from top to the bottom of a full frame fast enough. So it would just go like skip half the lines, read all the way down and revert and then do the half the lines again. So it's, and this concept is kind of important in quality control because like when, you know, obviously for digitization, we're taking all this like tape that's like 20, 30, 40 years old and just shoving it like one after another through a machine that's like then having to breathe in all the dust and dirt. And yeah, but this stuff gets messy, gets dirty. And these machines like, they have certain mechanisms to like push the dust and dirt away. Like this one has like this little blade here running along the tape trying to knock stuff out of the way. But when grime or dirt gets onto the drum here where it's reading the tape, like it'll block its ability to read. So it'll be trying to read, but there'll just be like a piece of dirt or grime there. When that happens, because the tape is composed of like two separate images that are zippered together, like one image will start to decay in quality faster than the other. Sometimes the deck will be dirty enough to like affect both at roughly the same rate, but usually when you have this kind of failure of reading a tape, like one side of it will get messed up and the other one will be okay. I'll show you some examples of that soon. And yeah, digitization software, it just kind of sucks because the software to digitize tape is going obsolete as fast as the hardware. Yeah, I think from here I'm going to skip over to QC tools and we can actually use the files we have. All right, so if you guys don't have a thumb drive, raise your hand and Rebecca will toss you a thumb drive.
I don't think I am out of them, so people might have to share.
Yeah. I used to have more, but like people borrow or don't hand them back. All right, so once you guys have your thumb drives, there's two DMG files in it, one called QC tools and one called media conch. Just like double click on those so you have access to those two applications.
Yeah, and just a note about that too, with on these machines, you don't want to try to move their things to applications folder, just open it.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
So just play it through from here.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so the one I'm going to start with is called QC tools. I'm going to get mine open. Bounce and verifying. Sure. All right, so while that's opening, I'm going to play this video here. This is on your sample drive. It starts with the letters NGA. This was from a Betacam tape. It's this like arts documentary. But as it plays, you'll start to see it start glitching. And then the video suddenly becomes much darker, like there. And then the amount of glitching and artifacts just gets substantially worse. This is a case where this was like early in our digitization work where we were digitizing files and spot checking them. So in our spot check, we didn't notice this error. When this error occurred, it started and it lasted for about 5 minutes, and we actually like broadcast this on the air. And people were like, why did you, like we should have done much better than this, but we missed this error when we were digitizing. So basically from this, we were able to like get the tape that we used to digitize that file, put it into the playback deck, and the second time we digitized it, like we had cleaned the deck and made the conditions more ideal, and we got a good transfer out of it. But when we got the first copy out, it was quite compromised. So I want to use QC tools like to dissect a little bit about what's happening in this file. So I'm going to take the NGA file and just like drag it into QC tools. I think it was Betacam, if I remember right. So when you put a file into QC Tools, it's going to start like loading left to right like this, and you're going to see various graphs. So I'm just going to let mine chug along for a little bit. There is a kind of toolbar at the top where you can enable and disable graphs. So right now I'm going to have all these graphs disabled except for the first three called Y, U, and B. Yeah, and this is the file I wish I had at WGBH because it's like way more interesting. So with analog videotape, it's generally made up of 3 separate planes of audiovisual data referred to as Y, U, and B, or Y, CB, and CR. But this is like a way of storing 3 different numbers that, when used together, can make like 1 pixel of color. Typically, when we're interacting with our screens, like our laptop screens or our televisions, they're documenting color as 3 values, like red, green, and blue, as these 3 different numbers that are used to combine to make like one pixel of color. And like if you got a microscope and put your laptop or your screen under it, you'd see like a red light, a green light, and a blue light all together, and they light up to different levels of brightness, and that combination like makes the color that you see. But with videotape, the designers of videotape were trying to like reduce the amount of data that had to get stored on the tape. And rather than store a red value, a blue, and a green, the idea is that the human eye is much less sensitive to color data than it is to brightness data. Like we can really pick up on how if something is dark or bright to a much finer degree than we can tell exactly like what shade of color it is or how vibrant that color is. So like YUV is what you get when you put like red, green, and blue for a particular set of equations to come up with YU and V. And YU and V basically just separates the brightness value all into Y, and then the color data all into U and V. So whereas red, green, and blue all used together indicate both brightness and color, in YU and V, those 2 concepts are separated. So that you have like, your kind of black and white image, and then these 2 separate other values that make up your color. So in looking at the graphs here, in each of these graphs for YU and V, it's showing 5 lines going across. The middle line is just like the average within the frame. So I can see, like, I'm just going to solo on the Y one currently. I can see if I like click and drag across that, like when I get to this point, the video is much darker. And I can see at the thumbnails below that, this image is relatively dark. Whereas over here, it's kind of where it's the brightest because it has this like white in the background. The other values are reflecting the maximum value at the top, the red one, the minimum value at the bottom. And then these green ones are documenting like the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. So they just ignore like the top and bottom 10% and plot the 90th and 10th percentile. So these values are kind of giving a gist on like the brightness of it. And U and V are showing like how the color is changing in it. So generally, like when I try to introduce people to QC tools and get them to play around with it, usually it's like we try to find like the weird incoherencies in the graphs and to examine like why it's so incoherent. So I can see in the V graph, like the minimum value is relatively stable for most of the video, but starts like going up and down pretty dramatically in this case. And this is like right where that glitch starts to happen. So if I open up the player, and you can open up the player part of QC Tools by just like clicking on the thumbnail strip. And then you can use these 2 components independently. Like, let's see if if I bring the graphs on one side and the player on the other side, like they'll stay correlated. So I can click and drag around the graphs. And the graphs also have like this zoom in feature. So if I'm like, what's this spike right here? I can pull up that particular frame. So with QC tools, like the graphs are supposed to kind of like alert you to certain errors because there's like just strange patterns happening, and the player helps you diagnose that a bit further. So with the player, what I'm going to do is just back this up near the beginning. And this time, right above the player, there's a checkbox called field. And like I was telling you, the analog video frames are generally like two half-height images that are like zippered together. If you click on the field button, it like unconnects those two images and stacks them on top of each other. So instead of seeing them like comprised together, like you'll just see like two images, one on top of another, by clicking that field checkbox at the top. So when I start playing that, you can start to see something, you know, interesting about the video, is that the error that's happening is just in the top field, whereas the bottom field is fine. This is pretty significant to realize because it's not feasible to have a camera or a recording device create a tape like that. Like generally, like a camera is going to say that what's in the odd lines and what's in the even lines is very identical. When they start to differ, it's often indicative that there is a flaw in the playback environment. In this case, the reader inside the deck, on one side of that drum, it's covered with enough dirt that it's not able to read the data out of it correctly. But on the other side of the drum, it's still clean enough to get a good image out of it. Whereas if both fields were comprised or affected in the same way, it would be more of a hint that maybe this is a problem with the tape itself. Like the tape is damaged, it's scratched. But because of how differentiated this is, it's pretty indicative of it being a hardware error. On the left side here, by default, like it's selected on waveform, and a waveform is it's like a calibration tool that lets you like adjust the brightness of the image. So generally, when somebody's putting in a videotape and they're getting it ready to record that presentation to a digital file, they'll make some adjustments to the brightness to get it right, so that the video is not too dark, the contrast is right, it's not too bright. Over here, I can also like separate that by field, so I'm seeing two together. So you can kind of see the same effect here. On the bottom side, the waveform is looking quite typical and normal, but on the top side, it's looking very chaotic because of what's happening there. The waveform has a couple different modes, so I can look at the planes individually. This graph right here is representing the brightness of the video, but I can change it to show the color data as well by changing from Y to U and V. This changes the plotted data to like green and blue. Or I can click on A to show all three together. Let's see. So if I'm playing it like this, I can see that the issue isn't just that the top field is damaged, but it's specifically the brightness information about that. I can see that the color data on both sides, and at the top I'm selecting A, so I'm seeing like the three channels all presented together, brightness and the two color ones. I can see that the color information is pretty much surviving on both sides, but the luminosity isn't. Like technically, I could take this file, separate out the information so that I can just like extract the luminance information from the bottom image and replace that over the top image, and I'd be able to like kind of craft a file that like reduce the error by like throwing away the information that we know is specifically wrong. In this case, it's much better to just like find this issue and like retrieve the source tape and clean the deck and try it again. But there would be some potential restoration that one could do here. And then I guess I should add, while I'm getting into all this deep technical stuff, that I don't mind questions, you know, or if you'd like clarification on what I'm showing you or looking at, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, let me go back to the picture. So the question was just to talk about how I clean the deck. Where's the playback button? Oh, present. Oh, I didn't want that. All right. So general, like this is a U-matic deck here, and the lid off, and you can see this like round drum here. You know, it just looks like a can basically. If you put your finger on it, you can move it around. It just like it spins there. So generally to clean it, I get these like lint-free little fabric wipes that are like 2 inches by 2 inches. Like they're intended to be wipes that are not fibrous. So if you're like rubbing it on something, it's not like leaving fibers or residues behind. You know, it's cloth, it's soft, but it's not going to like leave matter behind. You know, like sometimes if you take like a paper towel and you like try to clean your window, and then you're like, now I have like this crappy like paper dust. You know, it's not like that stuff. So generally I take like one of those fabric wipes. I take 99% pure isopropyl alcohol, and I like unscrew it, put the wipe on top, just like apply some of the alcohol to the wipe and then put it back. So then I have like a lint-free wipe that has like some alcohol in it. And one of the reasons to use like alcohol is that it evaporates very quickly. So it's going to be like, you know, self-drying relatively fast. So then I take that lint-free wipe and like hold it firmly in my fingers, and I don't know, like say this is the head drum that is like spinning like this. I'll just take it and like hold it to the side and then like spin the drum against my finger, staying in place. Because like on the drum here that has the readers, they'll be, you know, right on the edge here. And you don't want to apply any pressure that's not going in the direction that that head is normally moving. So like if I was scrubbing it vertically, like it would break and fall off. I only want to interact with it in its directional path. So generally, just to make sure that that's happening, I'm keeping my fingers very still, but applying a light pressure and just moving the drum against my fingers. So like my fingers will be holding that cloth, and I'll feel the reader go by. You know, it's like the size of a poppy seed, like on the edge of this thing. So you'll feel a little resistance as it comes by, but you're not supposed to be aggressive of it because it's a fairly delicate part of the machine. You know, but generally we'll do that every couple of U-matic tapes or so. It kind of depends like what tape format it is. Like sometimes the Digibeta tapes, like that, you know, they're not that dirty, they're much newer. But the U-matic tapes, we need pretty regular cleaning. I remember like recently I went and I visited my mom's house. It wasn't that recently, it was probably like 5 years ago. But she had a VCR, so I was like, I'm gonna try cleaning this thing. And it was just like so gross in there. It was like really satisfying to like, you know, get a wipe and like try to clean like the drum inside like your parents' VCR. It's like a good starter place to do it because it's gonna be filthy. Nobody's cleaned that thing since it was bought. So it's a good practice place, and just don't break that VCR. And then from there, there's a bunch of places inside the deck where the tape is going to come in contact with the deck. There'll be like these little like roller pins and pin guides that are moving the tape around. And the same thing with those surfaces, you'd want to take the cloth and just clean those as well to make sure they're okay. I don't know, Rebecca, am I missing anything about deck cleaning you want to add? Or?
I don't think so. Generally, recommendations I've heard are definitely if you're going to be doing a bunch of digitization, you know, clean it when you start up the deck. Like first thing, let the deck warm up. You know, you switch it on, let it sit for a couple minutes, you clean it. Some people recommend cleaning it in between every tape that you digitize, just because they're all going to leave a little bit of residue on it. Definitely at the beginning and end of every day, like every digitization session, you want to clean it, just because you never know what kind of gunk is going to get on it. Don't accidentally pour an entire bottle of isopropyl alcohol into the innards of a deck.
Yeah, cool, good one.
Which I did once.
And generally, like when you take the cloth, apply it to the edge of that drum and like move the drum so the reader crosses the cloth, like it'll leave a little mark. Like, you know, you'll see a little dirty line there. So the presence of that residue is your indicator on like if it's clean or not. Because like if you're putting the cloth in and like there's nothing coming out, like you don't see any residue, then like you don't really need to clean the deck. But if it comes out filthy, then yeah, clean it.
I guess the other thing is that there are some, like it depends on the kind of tape that you've got. So there are some decks, like DV decks, for example, and you can actually buy a little cleaner tape for those decks. And in those cases, I think for the DV deck, using the cleaner deck, like little cleaning tapes, is considered to be safer than actually trying to clean it for yourself.
Yeah.
But if you're doing like a U-matic or an old VHS, probably your hands are gonna, like you're gonna be able to clean that deck better than anything automated can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never seen like a U-matic cleaning tape. I wonder
I don't
if
think
they've
they
made one.
exist. I think VHS do cleaning tapes. Cleaning tapes do exist, but they're not very good.
but they those cleaning tapes are like they kind of do the same thing. It's just like the tape is like kind of fuzzy. I think if I remember right, like you wouldn't be able to like dub it onto another tape to like copy cleaning tapes. Like you have to.
They're not made of actual tape.
All right, so while I'm looking at this file, I wanted to show another diagnostic tool here. It's called, I'm going to look at a filter called Extract Planes Equalized. And this has the same like radio buttons at the top to switch between 3 different views. So basically what this does is this lets you isolate the individual channels of a frame. Because a frame is going to be made up of 3 pieces of data, like the luminosity data. And yeah, I'm going to switch this to field so we can see the 2 parts of it again. Yeah, it looks cool. So here on the first one, I just have the normal player, but it's in field mode. So I have them stacked on top of each other, the one field and the other. And on the other side, I'm using Extract Planes Equalized. And that's just letting me isolate out the individual planes. So if I click on Y, basically I'm looking at the black and white image of the video. If I click over to U, this is one of the color planes. So this type of information generally isn't intended to be presented as a grayscale image like I'm seeing on the right. But this is like the color data of the video. It's not shown in this way because normally it's sent through a calculation to get it back to red, green, and blue values. But QC Tools does let you isolate it. And then the last one, V, is there as well. So by isolating out these individual ones, I can really see like, you know, the color data for the top and the bottom are rather identical. The same for the U plane. It's just really the Y plane where there's this big discrepancy that's causing the glitch in this particular video. And yeah. So this is my favorite demo video. So from here, I want to go into a couple of the other graphs. So I'm going to turn on this one called diffs. Diffs is good. Let's see. What? Yeah, I'll put on Y diff. There we go. So the diffs graph is basically plotting over the timeline the difference between one frame and the next. So there's a couple places where it spikes up really high, and if you like kind of scrub your mouse over those points, it's scene changes where like you're cutting from one shot to the next. So it makes sense that like a bunch of the video is going to be substantially different at a scene change because you're like cutting from like one set of pixels to another. But in this graph, you can see like besides the scene changes, which are single spikes, there's a bunch of other like data, like turbulent data here. And that's mostly coming from the fact that like there's all this garbage like just being thrown all over the image. There are other things that would kind of cause this level of turbulence, like camera pans, like where a bunch of the frame is all changing at a gradual base, but it generally wouldn't be as like random as you see it is here. You know, so if you put in like some of the other sample files I gave you, you'd see something that's a bit more harmonious. You'd see like occasional single spikes where there's a scene change. Otherwise, it would be fairly flat data. And then let's see. I think from here I'm going to go to another sample file because I want to see Ginger Rogers. So there's a file here called 11_DAN Rogers 2. So I'm going to bring that in. That's 11_DAN Rogers 2 is this. It's like an interview clip of Ginger Rogers. And I'll play it here so you can see a bit of what the error is. This is a U-matic tape that has binder hydrolysis or sticky shed. The tape is quite sticky because like as it's decayed, like, you know, videotape is basically like this very clear plastic layer, and then the iron oxide layer that's holding all the magnetic information, but then there's a layer of glue that's binding those two layers together. As the glue decays, the long molecular threads of the glue that are bonding those two sides together start to break down. And as they break down small enough, they can start to permeate the surface. So the surface of the tape becomes slightly sticky. So when we play a tape like this in the deck, it's really annoying because it sounds like you're hurting an animal. Like you'll hear this like squealy sound and everyone will be very alarmed in the room. You can address this by cleaning the tape or baking it. But basically the stickiness makes the tape kind of start and stop at a very high frequency as it's trying to move through the deck because of the stickiness. But in this case, it's producing errors like the one we see here.
It also loses particles of data as it's doing it, which is why it's sticky shed, because it sticks. And also it sheds magnetic particles at the same time. Fun.
It's not fun. Where's my player stuck? Oops. Open. Just a second for me to catch up. So the audiovisual data coming out of a deck is, it's not reliably constant. With digital video, each frame is beginning at a very precise time. Like with the video we use in the States here, mostly the frame rate is 30,000 divided by 1001, which is about 29.9700029997, and then like this infinite expression. But every like 29.997th of a second, like you'll have a new frame starting exactly then. But with analog tape, there's not the same level of reliability, like it's not as precise. So generally, like when you have an analog video player that's sending out this older, less fine-tuned signal, we need to like get it to be as precisely timed before it can be digitized. So there are these devices called time-based correctors where it's going to receive all the video coming in, and it's going to like store it in a queue, but then release like one frame per unit of time, so that information is coming into it with some fluctuation, but it's coming out of it at a very reliable. I don't know. Am I explaining a time-based corrector right? You? Yeah. Okay. So the time-based corrector will be receiving this data, storing it very momentarily, and releasing it at a particular schedule, so that you're getting like one frame for very precise amounts of time. But often the time-based corrector that's receiving that signal is going to be struggling to figure out like what the signal actually is, because the tape will be so decayed, or parts of it will be shedding off. So that's what's happening in this case. Like the tape is shedded sufficiently that it's not presenting correctly. So with this time-based corrector, when it's receiving that information and holding it in memory, if it's receiving subsequent information that is just like unrecognizable as video or of insufficient quality, what the time-based corrector is doing is it's just like feeding the same data it already collected. So in the case of this frame I have here, like you can see in her hair, like the detail like stopped, and it's just like the same line over and over. You can see this more specifically like when I split them in two. I'm going to go into the zoom view here. Let's see. There's this one filter called zoom where I can like zoom in on parts of it. So like this is the exact same digital line just fed over and over and over, because the time-based corrector like isn't receiving data sufficient here to actually use as a line. So in QC tools, there's this graph here called VREP, which is short for like vertical line repetition. And this is a graph of like when the same line is being fed over and over again. And it's kind of, it's counting that. So like you can see these peaks here and where this issue is specifically happening. In the player, there's also a player called vertical line repetition. And if I select that, wait, it's not highlighting it for me. Oh, this is like the demo thing where I'm like trying to show.
Live demo.
Oh, you know why this is happening? It's because like I forgot. Normally, like the test file set I use for this, we use like uncompressed, lossless files. But because I had like such small thumb drives to distribute for you guys, I had to like compress all the video before sending it to you on these thumb drives. So like the master file for this, which would have all the detail to like trip the error, isn't in the compressed copies that I gave to you. It's still there sufficiently that it's coming up here and there with some information, but if I had the original or the uncompressed copy, there would be so much more. This is a good reason for like quality controlling on the master file rather than on a derivative.
On the other hand, quality controlling on a master file is very slow.
Yeah, like it's pretty recognizable here. There's an error here that's not what Ginger Rogers' head looks like or her hair looks like, but you're just getting the same line over and over again. This particular test to like have QC tools test and tally when the same line is occurring multiple times in a row is a good test to use with digitization of analog video, because an analog video tape shouldn't be able to create the exact same line right in a row, because analog videotape is always noisy. It has like some amount of grain or like randomness to it, so that even if you're trying to record something that is just like a plain piece of paper, all the lines of a videotape documenting that are going to have their own variation to it. There's going to be noise throughout it. On the other hand, if you were like generating computer animated video in a computer and then like writing it out onto a digital tape, like a digital Betacam, you would have a lot of cases where you have frames that exhibit the same exact line multiple times in a row. So when it's in the context of an analog tape, this is very indicative that there's an error or a problem with the tape or the playback environment. But if it was being applied to a digital tape, it would produce false flags all the time, because it would be like, these are color bars, or this is just like a title card with a solid background. Like all the lines are supposed to be the same in some context. But for analog media, it shouldn't be.
Does everyone know what the difference is between an analog physical tape and a digital physical tape?
Oh man, Rebecca, segue here. You want to use the microphone?
So there are a bunch of tapes, like physical tapes, that have digital content recorded onto them. So something like
some water while you're...
Yeah, I thought you might want the opportunity. A DV Cam or a DVC Pro or a DAT tape. These kind of formats sound familiar to anybody? And what that means is that it's an actual digital signal that was recorded onto that tape medium. So instead of being analog waveform data, messy, noisy data that's like what's on a film, it's actually recorded as dots, points on a line, binary data. It can be something that can be translated exactly into a digital file, and that digital file can be copied exactly place to place to place to place to place, because it's digital and not analog. So when you're digitizing a digital tape, what you're generally going to try and do is actually get a copy of that code data, kind of the underlying dot points that make up that file exactly, rather than what you're doing with something like a U-matic, where you're translating an analog signal into a digital file that's something that, it can be made into a piece of code. Is that an okay explanation?
Yeah, I dug it, didn't you guys? Yeah, cool. I didn't hear all of it because I was like chugging water in the hallway, but for us, like the workflow for digitizing analog and digital tape is very different, because if it is a digital tape, we just basically need to like move the data off of it as is, and there's not as much need to like manipulate that data. So if it's loud, if it's dark, if it's bright, if it's digital, like we can just like maintain a copy of the data as it is. Whereas if it's an analog tape, we have to be like, is it supposed to be loud? Is it supposed to be this dark? Calibrate it. That's often why like analog tapes have color bars on it to like define, a test pattern that represents like what the intended level of color and brightness is. Whereas digital tapes wouldn't have the same need for that as analog materials. All right, next test file. I guess going off that, I'm going to use these two test files here they start with BA and BC, and drag both of them in. Sorry, yes, question?
So how would, what would you have to do to go back and fix the Ginger Rogers file? Like, is that like a hardware issue as well?
The Ginger Rogers file, like, let's see. To fix this type of issue, I think in this case, the U-matic deck, the video deck, is doing the best job it can with like a really bad recording. like with a tape like this, there's probably a lot of need to like clean it, you know, before and after. Like after running this tape through it, like this deck definitely needs to be cleaned. You could get some change by using a different time-based corrector. In our case, we're using a fairly modern time. No, this I think was an older one, like a DPS 595. No, 295. The tactic of that time-based corrector is like to just repeat the same line, but that's not a common strategy to like all time-based correctors. Some time-based correctors, instead of doing this, it would just show like white fuzz, like the kind of speckle you get on like a crappy VHS tape. So if you had like some aesthetic preference on how you like your damage, you could like change your time-based corrector. But you know, the way we'd have the best chance to resolve this is to like treat the tape. So like I can't remember what we did to this tape next, but potentially like baking a pneumatic tape, like if you put it in like a small oven or food dehydrator at a low temperature for a couple of days, it basically like resets the glue, like repairs the molecular structures, so that the glue that's permeating the surface is like retracted in temporarily. So you get a short amount of time to like retransfer the tape. Like this technique is used with like 1/4-inch audio reels and pneumatic tape, and I don't know if it's used too much for other formats.
Most open reel tapes, I think, can make
Yeah.
and pneumatic.
Baking a tape is kind of tricky because like sometimes the tape will have like splices in it that have their own glue, and like baking them will just like make a mess. So like it's a difficult procedure to use. I think like some folks that bake tapes like often like disassemble the cassette and will take the reel of tape out and just bake that and then reassemble everything back together after. But I remember like the first time I tried doing it was at Democracy Now! We had all these like 1/4-inch audio reels that we'd have to put onto the machine, like loop the tape through and around and play it. And then some of them would make this loud squealing sound and they would sound really bad. So this was like in my first year being an archivist, I remember like we had a conference call with somebody at the Library of Congress that was like, yeah, we have like a little incubator and we just put the tapes in there and then it sounds good later. And we're like, wait, really? And it just like felt like such a magic trick because we got like a food dehydrator for making jerky and just put like some tape in it. It was like this round one where when you lift it off, it had like these donut shaped trays that you put like your apricot slices on or whatever, but it was like just the right size to put like a reel of tape like in the whole thing. Yeah, so we just like baked tapes and then they played good. It was really fun.
You also use like chicken incubators, like the kind of things. So you want to bake it, you're not baking it like you bake cake at like 100 degrees. You're baking
You want to
it
go faster, yeah.
You're baking it at like very low, like 100.
Yeah, like a little over 100, not much higher.
So like, you know, the kind of temperature that like when you're trying to incubate chicken eggs to get them to hatch faster. I've seen people use that. Another thing is that sometimes, like, you know, when you send your tape to a vendor, they'll usually have a bunch of different decks and a bunch of different TPPs. And if they see a tape like this, they'll probably try a couple of different combinations to see if they can get a better digitization copy. Like there are some cases, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a better transfer when you put it through a TPC and it like stabilizes the signal and sets it at a regular time. But also sometimes it introduces these errors. And sometimes you can actually, you know, that 1 time out of 10, you might actually get a better read off the tape if you're not using a TBC. You just let the tape talk directly to your.
Wait, really? What?
Software.
Normally, if I try not to use a time-based corrector at all or a TBC, then like the computer just can't see it. It'll see like a couple of frames like flickering in because it'll happen to be close enough, but it like won't be enough to read it.
And sometimes I've seen it both. I've often seen it with, especially not so much with pneumatic, but sometimes with Betacam, where the Betacam deck has its own little internal stabilizer, and then you run it through the additional TPC, and the additional TPC just throws it all out of whack. Like it's overcorrecting for stuff that doesn't necessarily need to be corrected.
So,
Dave, I have a question.
Hey.
Before you move on, why was I'm looking at the saturation graph, and why did the scale change between the QuickTime file and the MP4 file of Ginger Rogers?
oh, did I give you 2 quick Ginger Roger? Oh,
See here, it's,
oh, you mean the x-axis?
yes.
Okay, that's a good question. To answer that, I'm going to go back to the Y graph. So this Y graph is documenting the brightness of all the frames. So I can see like there's a slow trend for this file to get brighter, but not much of one because it's just a single shot. But let's see, is that the x-axis is showing over time, like from the beginning of the video to the end of the video. The y-axis in this case, on my monitor here, it's labeled from 0 to 1023. But if I go, let's see, I think yeah, so this file here, it goes from 0 to 255. The difference here is based on the bit depth of the video. Because if you have video at 8-bit, where it's using like 8 ones and zeros to describe every sample, like then it would define like how many like shades or unique values you have. So with this 8-bit video, it has 256 shades of gray going from like 0 to 255. But if you like increase the bit depth to 10, that would be like 2 to the 10th power, which would be like from 0 to 1023. So you just have like more, more numbers to use from. So, it's kind of like if you go to the grocery store and you get crayons, like if you're buying a box of like 16 crayons, it'd be like 4-bit. But if you bought a box of like 256 crayons, it'd be 8-bit. I don't know. I really hope somewhere Crayola makes a 1024 crayon set. But when you're doing a digitization project, you need to kind of define like how many ones and zeros you're going to use for each piece of data. So for video, the most common options are 8-bit and 10-bit. 10-bit is larger. It uses more data, more servers, more LTO tape, more e-waste, but it gives you a greater level of accuracy because you're not like rounding off as much as with 8-bit. But in general, almost all the video we see day to day, like on the internet or television, is 8-bit. 10-bit video is used primarily in like professional broadcast environments and preservation. So the scale you're seeing here is based on the bit depth that's used. With the
I'm accustomed to using 10-bit, and so the definition for this filter is not based on 10-bit.
Oh, it's basically, oh yeah, like when you mouse over these options at the top, it'll give you a little dialog box.
That's where my confusion came from.
I think like the tool that's actually generating this data is part of the FFmpeg project, this shared, very open source collaborative project. And at one point, somebody updated it to manage different bit depths to be 8-bit and 10-bit. So in the next release of QC tools to build off their source code, then it like added in this differentiation. So it would keep the math in the native bit depth. But the documentation obviously lagged behind because we haven't been on the project in a little while. So
is there an easy way that you can, in 60 seconds, explain how to correlate the definition for 8-bit to a 10-bit?
Multiply or divide by 4. Multiply or divide by 4 would be the way to cross-reference between the two. So like if the documentation is in 8-bit, but your video is in 10-bit, if you multiply it all values by 4, you'd have the 10-bit scale.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let me see. Oh, so I wanted to follow up on the graph he was pointing out. He was talking about the saturation graph. And this is basically saying like how saturated is the color, like how vibrant is it. If this graph was very low, your graph would be closer to black and white. Like a black and white video would just be like a straight line at the bottom. If it was extremely vibrant, it would be up higher. But because the sample data in YUV has to go through a conversion process to turn into RGB, red, green, and blue, there's a limit, whereas if it crosses a certain threshold, it would create a negative number or an overflow. So there's these dashed lines here. And if you mouse over the saturation definition, it'll kind of explain what the dashed lines are. But the first one is kind of the limit as to where broadcast saturation will be. And then the second one, if you exceed that, you end up with like these mathematically illegal conversions. So the best sample file in this set to look at the saturation value is called like 6_DHC. So when I bring in the file called 6_DHC, in my saturation graph, I can see it like completely peaks out at the beginning. It's like all the way up, and then it kind of dips. You know, I can see at a couple points, like the saturation dips all the way down to the bottom, and then comes back up. And the frames underneath, you can see when I go to these little places where it dips all the way down, that basically the frame is black and white at those points. You know, like right here. And then the color comes back, because that's how video works. It's just like here and then it's not, you know, and you have to figure it out later while you're quality controlling. Back to black and white. So with this tape, it's like a damaged tape. And basically, the way this time-based, I'm not exactly sure if this is coming from the time-based corrector, but I'm suspicious that it is. The way the time-based corrector is handling a compromised tape is it's filling in all these like green spots here. So you get this like bright, vibrant green mixed into the image that it isn't supposed to be there. That green correlates to like where the saturation graph goes up. So when you see it coming up so high, all those frames are having these like green strange blocks in there. So one of the playback filters in here is called vector scope. And let me see if I can make this a little brighter here. There. So the vector scope is a calibration tool that's used when you're first setting up a tape to digitize. Like you put the tape in, you'd have a time-based corrector to make some adjustments, and you'd see the color represented in this vector scope as a graph, where it's taking the two color planes U and V and plotting all the data onto this like two-dimensional axis. So if the video is black and white, and I can go to a black and white frame. There, like this video frame has no color pretty much. It's black and white. So all the data gets clustered in the center. The further out from the center it gets, the more colorful it is. This is a color bar video where it has these 6 colors: red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow. And that correlates to these 6 little clusters of dots that you have in the vector scope. So there's red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow, these 6 colors. So if you're playing a videotape back and it has color bars, your vector scope will have boxes like marked on the vector scope to these 6 color points. And you would like calibrate the video to move your plotted data into those 6 boxes. And then you'd be able to say like, hey, this is supposed to be what the color is supposed to look like on this. Because these color bars were quite standardized. The red, green, and blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow were all supposed to be like these fixed color values. So a vector scope is, I don't know, do you guys have a vector scope here in the pile of tools you have downstairs? Or? Oh, you got it. You gotta get it.
You guys do. I think the equipment that you have is it's just stacks A to D. You might have a time-based corrector floating around.
Yeah.
And CRT. I don't think you have the specialized waveform monitor vector scope.
Yeah, I mean, there's still software-based vector scopes. So you don't necessarily need to have like a 1980s, like 50-pound vector scope, but like you can get software to do it. But as I scrub through the video, actually this video I think is just color bars. Let me look at like what some real content looks like here. Ginger Rogers on the vector scope. So Ginger Rogers is quite yellow. So you can see all these pixels that are black, basically black and white with no color in the center. And then there's this kind of like gradation of like yellow and her lipstick, her skin color. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of like color diversity in this clip.
It's pretty monochrome.
Go back. Oh yeah, this is the 5A Born Digital one. I wanted to bring in the Born Digital vector scope because you can see the difference. Like as far as Born Digital video, it's far less messy than the other recordings of color bars. This has been completely generated in a Born Digital context, and it has like the scrolling gradient of color at the bottom that is like connecting the dots here. But basically, you have your 6 colors in the scrolling gradient. The gradient doesn't quite fill the whole color range, so that's why there's this little gap of color in the vector scope moving around. So with this file, after I made this file, I recorded it onto a U-matic tape and then digitized it back. So this is like the U-matic tape. This is 5C. And you can see like how different it is after going through a U-matic tape effect. Like a U-matic tape is a terribly lossy carrier for audiovisual signals. It's going to compromise a lot of data to put it there and back. But it makes cool, like the waveform looks more fun over here than it did with the poor digital copy. So.
Yeah, that's kind of the big difference between analog and digital content. Whenever you put analog, even if you put digital content recorded in the analog format, any copy you can make from that analog format, you're never going to get that exact same version back. It's always a little lossier, and a little lossier, and a little lossier.
The other calibration tool that's often used with a vector scope is called a waveform monitor. So it looks like this. And instead of plotting the two color values on the y and x axis, the x-axis is basically presenting the video from like left to right. And then from top to bottom on the y-axis is the level of brightness. So right here, the brightest part of the video is the rightmost column. It's white with a little bit of like green gradient at the bottom. So that's why on the right edge of the waveform, it's plotted to be the highest. The darkest component is here on the left, the black one, and that's why on the left side of the waveform monitor, it's at the bottom. And then, the values in the middle, cyan, magenta, yellow, red, green, and blue, are plotted here accordingly as these different like 6 steps you have in the middle. The gradient line that's going down the center of the video is like this kind of like zigzag line of changes of brightness. It looks cool if you play this because you see, doesn't my player work? I fix my player. So this kind of shows off like the left to right relationship between the main presentational image and the waveform monitor. That like as the gradient is moving left to right, so is this like zigzag bar on the waveform monitor.
You can also see where, because there's the spike for the level of each of the bars, in addition to the gradient of the line moving through. So the waveform monitor kind of tracks all those things at once.
And put this on free scale. So on the waveform monitor, there's a dotted line at the bottom and top. And this marks the high end and low end of broadcast range. So even though the video is at 8-bit, so there's a potential of like 0 to 255 different unique numerical values. The top 16 and the bottom 16 are reserved. And so it's like from 16 to 235 is white to black, or black to white. What's above that and below that is also just white and black. Like there's not, it doesn't present any differently. So when you're calibrating video, generally you're trying to set your color bars between two defined points of like where black is and where white is. Because if you go too high, you'd end up losing detail, and if you go, if you went too low, you'd lose detail. So like in this case, like this video is well calibrated. Like it's, the white level is like right at the dashed line. It's not above it. And the black level is at the lower dashed line and not below it. If you go to, there's a playback option here called broadcast range pixels. What this does is it's taking pixels that are outside of broadcast range and highlighting them in yellow. So I can see here like some of the color or is too saturated. Like this is like a little bit too vibrant. Also, some of the black pixels on the very left are highlighted in yellow because they're too low. If I look at the waveform monitor, I can see that at the very left, there's like some pixels that are too low. It goes below the dashed line. So this is just a viewer that's intended to like reveal to you like what data is going too far out of range. Because like the more pixels that would be in yellow here, the more data is potentially being lost to like things being set too high or too bright. And all right, I'm going to go back to Born Digital to show a couple more things. So right now I'm at the file called 5A, Born Digital. One thing I wanted to show in here is called the bit plane because it's like super cool. I love this. This is like my favorite part of QC Tools. So this is just like, this is the first bit, the first 1 or 0 of the Y position for the file. So if that bit is 1, it's white. If it's 0, then it's black. It's just, so this image is only supposed to show you like white and black only. So, and as I go here and I say like, I want the Y position to be the next bit, as I step up through the bits, it's showing what each bit position looks like. And actually here, even though it's compressed, it's still like relatively stable. Like there's not a whole lot of artifacts in it. No, and it is 10-bit. So this is like the lowest bit here, 10-bit. So like as I'm stepping through the bits here, like because there's a gradient at the bottom, it like really shows it off well, because like the stripes are going to get like thinner and thinner as I step into the lower bits. So like here they're quite close together. I'm at like bit 7 and then 8. But then if I go over to the copy that I sent to UMatic tape, it's going to be a far different story. So like, oh, this looks good. All right, so this is off of UMatic tape. I'm going to go back to the bit plane. Here's bit 1. It looks it looks fine. You know, there's like a little bit of smoothness to the edges. But as I go into the lower bits, it's going to look messier and messier. And actually, like part of this, I forgot, like this is one reason why I typically use uncompressed or lossless files. If like an uncompressed or lossless, you would see like a very noisy image here. But because I compress this to fit onto the thumb drives, you're seeing like the artifacts of the compression itself in the bit plane viewer. So like these patterns here aren't part of the original digital file at all. They're not part of the analog tape that it came from, but it's the generation after that, the H.264 compression. Generally, like lossy compression will make the file much smaller by trying to figure out like what parts of the file aren't easily perceptible to the eye, and like playing with that data to reduce it, compress it, and throw it away. But like what a lot of QC Tools does is takes those parts of the video and make them very prominent by presenting the video in a way that's not intended to be shown at all. So in places like the bit plane viewer, you can like really see the evidence of the compression quite clearly. At one point, I'd like to take like a bunch of different types of audiovisual codecs, like MPEG-2, DV, H.264, VP9, and then show like what the lower bits look like in those, because they all kind of have their own common pattern because they use their own techniques on throwing image data away. Yeah, so that's the bit plane viewer. Also, like one thing that's helpful about the bit plane viewer is just to like make sure you actually have data in your lower bits, because like one common mistake is that like an archive will be like, I want this analog videotape digitized to a 10-bit file. But then the person digitizing the tape will use like a time-based corrector or some hardware that's processing the video at 8 bits, and then just like adding 2 zeros at the end to make it 10-bit. So sometimes you'll have a file that's technically 10-bit, but the last 2 bits are just 0 all the time and don't actually have any meaningful data in there.
I did that recently, and I called the vendor out on it. Those vendor-generated files.
Yeah.
QC Tools was what flagged that for me.
Nice. I'm glad I'm getting vendors in trouble.
I mean, that's the kind of thing that's why you always want to check your files when you're getting them back from a vendor, right? Like even, you know, hopefully you can trust your vendor, and most of the time you can, but even so, there's going to be stuff that they miss. There's going to be issues. You want to do some human review to make sure that they correctly understood the specifications you gave them, because you might have reasons for doing things and having things done a certain way that your vendor might not necessarily understand. So having tools like this and actually taking the time to review the files at the other end is really important to make sure that the stuff you're getting back is actually the stuff you want to be preserving for the long term.
I say like one case where I'm using QC Tools a lot, well, not a lot, but like often in an archive, you'll have multiple copies of the same work, and you'll have to figure out like which one of these deserves to be the main focus to like preserve this work. Because like we'll have a really complex production, and we'll be like, why do we have 5 copies of this? And then we'll have to figure out like which one is the original or which one's better quality. So like you can kind of see like some comparison here. Like you can, you know, in this case it's kind of exaggerated, but the file is called 5A and 5C. One's born digital, and one has been copied to U-matic and back. When you look at them in the waveform, you'll see like the waveform is much less, it's much more fuzzy. There's more randomness to it in 5C, the copy that came from an analog tape. Whereas I go to the original born digital file, that waveform image is far cleaner. Like the lines are very crisp, they're not as fuzzy. Whereas like every generation it goes down, it's just going to become messier and messier as more random image data falls in there. I have one file that shows that really well in its uncompressed copy. I'm not sure how well it's going to look in the compressed copy you have, but it's called Generation Loss Betacam. So if generation loss Betacam, it's just a color bar file. I know that's like mostly what we're watching today. But basically, as you move forward in this file, like every 5-second chunks, it goes like a generation down. So like somebody was just like copying color bars onto one tape, onto another tape, onto another tape, and then sampling those generations of tapes and pulling them all back in. You can see like in the process when she was doing that, the tape gets brighter at each step. And you can also see like the waveform just gets like messier and messier until at the end, like it's, you know, this is like 5 generations away from the original at least. You know, so but like by going through this thing, you can see quite clearly like where it starts from and like where it ends up. Like there's a lot more noise and randomness that is impacting every single pixel in each generation as it moves ahead. So in cases where you have like a couple, you know, 4 or 5 different copies of the same tape and you need to like figure out like which one is the source, you can use some of the tools to like, you know, to figure out like which signal looks the cleanest, you know, or be able to interpret like the level of errors in each one. So one graph, I'm gonna use this same generation loss to show off this graph called tout, which stands for temporal outlier. You can see the graph of it looks kind of like a staircase because it's stepping from like one generation to the next in this color bar tape. Tout stands for temporal outlier. And basically the point of this test is that if you pick a random pixel in a video frame and it's like blue, like it's pretty likely that in the prior frame or the next frame at that same position, that pixel will also be blue. So this test is to compare a pixel to its temporal neighbor of the prior frame. Because if you're watching a videotape, it should just, and you're just looking at like one pixel value, it should just be like blue, 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 or like blue, blue, light blue, you know, and like some transition that's gradual. But if it just goes from like blue to pure white back to blue, it's tallied as like a temporal outlier, like it's an outlier in time for that pixel's position. So the number of outliers per frame is counted and then evaluated. So generally, like this test kind of started by like looking for the concept of like when you get like that white speckle on like a VHS tape or an older recording, and you just have like those kind of random patterns that show up on it. So in this graph of the generation loss, you can see that quite clearly because the level of randomness in outliers is going to increase with each generation loss. So you get this kind of nice staircase effect. I have some other files, like I'm going to use DHC 413. It's called Crease or Not.
It's also about 4:30. Do people need a break, like to use the bathroom?
All right, I'll show off this like one file and finish my tout talk, and then we'll take a break. Yeah, and then we'll do more. So like tout is in here. It's I think there's like a VH crinkle here. It's like it's easier to see this in the uncompressed copy than it is in the compressed copies we have here. All right, so I'm going to show off tout in one more file called it's called like a huge number, and then it's called head clogging. But it's this video here. and you can see that the temporal outliers like increase and increase and then kind of fall off here. But the increasing in the temporal outlier is correlating to this issue right here where you're getting like a full head clog. Like there's so much dirt in the deck that it's just covering both sides of the head and the image kind of turns into this. This is like what you get with a lot of like the dirtiest tapes. You'll be like trying to play them back and eventually the image is just going to disappear into a snowstorm of randomness like it does here. And then you have to get it, get the deck, clean it meticulously, and then you put the tape back in, then maybe you get like a few more minutes until it gets right back where it was. Some of the filthiest tape you have to like clean, you have to transfer them in multiple different parts because they're so filthy, unless you have a fancy tape cleaner or you put it in the dishwasher or something.
And then you're trying to like sew the bits back together so you get one full file, which is always kind of fun.
All right, and then since it's 4:30, it's like water, bathroom, break, hang out. What time do you want to come back and end our break? Or wait, who's host? Lily, you pick. What time?
I don't know.
Cool, cool. All right, see you at 4:45. How about that? All right, cool. Welcome back to the workshop. Sorry, to jump back into it, I'm going to use a sample file called chrominance noise. And I'm just looking at it. Right now I'm looking at it in the YU and V graphs, and I just have those enabled. This is from a black and white tape, but obviously like there's information in here that's just not black and white. There's color information here too. So when I'm looking at the color graphs, I can see these two like areas of blobs of color. And then when I look at those frames in here, let's see, frames in the player. Try to find an area where oh, there it is. I don't know if you can see too well here, but there's like a bunch of like random red, green, and blue color like over this image. And that's like correlating to, where these little spikes and mountains are here. I'm not exactly sure on what's causing this or why it's here, but I don't know, I like those errors. So yeah, so there's a bunch of color just like kind of falling all over this. There's one filter we looked at earlier called extract planes equalized, and here I can see the individual planes like the Y, the U, and the V. Again, this is an area where like using uncompressed or lossless video would show something very different, but you can kind of see this like flickery pattern that comes in while playing over those sections. Yeah, like this kind of graininess here. So if you have video that's intended to be all black and white, you can kind of see like if it actually is or isn't using data like this. The saturation graphs and hue graphs kind of show a similar correlation, just like in a mathematically different way. And then I also wanted to show with this video the tout graph, so the tout graph comes up for temporal outliers because this video does have some scratches in it that come up in tout. Let me see. Yeah, like this little, I can set one side to no display and you can see like this kind of like smearing shape and like these white pixels that come in. Those are coming up in the tout graph. And that's generally because like the deck's dirty, the tape's dirty, or the tape's damaged itself. So the gist of the way I usually tell people to get used to QC tools is like the individual graphs to start to look at for abnormalities in the patterns of the graphs. And then like in scrubbing over them, like you'd see the thumbnails underneath and like you'd be able to connect it into the player. So you'd be able to correlate like what's happening in the graphs to like what's happening in the video. So like when you're doing a large scale digitization project and you have to do like a lot of quality control in an efficient amount of time, rather than opening the file and just checking out it a little bit at the beginning, middle, and end, QC tools kind of helps guide you to areas of the file that are suspicious, because it's like, why is this, why are these different patterns happening? you know, if I'm looking at a graph like this, I can tell like this part of the video is probably fine. There's not a lot of dramatic issues happening here, but over here there is plenty. Let me see if there's any other. I'm gonna go in here and see if there's any other filters I wanted to show off. This is looking at under broadcast range pixels. This is like highlighting it in yellow. I showed a little bit of this before, like the pixels that are outside of broadcast range. So that's just hitting like when the window's in view. Let me see. There's a data scope filter here, and I'm trying to zoom in on that. So what this filter is doing is basically showing the numerical value of each pixel in the video. In case for some reason that's what you need to do, you need to, you know, if you wanted to look up certain values, you could do it in here. So this gives you like the column and row number of every single pixel, as well as the 3 values for Y, U, and V. It's used for like very specialized like research into errors sometimes, but sometimes you'll find like certain patterns happening in there. Let's see what else I didn't show off. This filter I'm playing right now is called lines over time, and this is selecting one line and then just like instead of moving on to the next line in time order, it's just like scrolling it up. Let me find a different file to play that under. Yeah, I'm going to use I'm going to play that under 5C, the UMatic one. So right now I have line number 243 selected. So it's just going to show that line and just like keep moving it upward over time. I found this filter helpful for examining closed caption data sometimes, but I don't think I have a sample of closed caption data, unfortunately. Let me just take a look and see if I do. Oh, maybe this one does, the NGA one. No, it doesn't have closed caption data. Ah. And I showed a little bit before the waveform viewer, how this is showing like the full left to right image on a graph that's showing it from like bright to dark. There's one in here called line select, where you can pick out like one specific line to do that graphing under. You know, so I can set different ones and pick them. This is also helpful if you have like caption data or timecode data in the top of your video, because then you can just like analyze that one specific line. That would be like when you see those patterns of dashed lines at the top and they contain like accessibility data or timing data. Let's see, that might end up being all I want to fish out for examples here. Oh, although my other favorite is called Zoom, and that just kind of gives you like an overlay box where you can, you know, basically use this as like a little magnifying glass to get in like really close to some of the video, you know, and then adjust it to getting closer. You know, but it keeps all the pixels with the, like that same shape. So the pixels just end up getting bigger as you zoom in rather than kind of being blurred together. Yeah, so let's see, that's the player and the graphs. So, oh, when we were talking about this at WGBH earlier, we kind of classified the errors into 2 sets. One would be to verify the calibration of the playback. So like when you're putting in the tape, generally you want to test the video for these 4 different qualities: the brightness, the contrast, for the brightness and contrast, just how white or black it is and how much of a difference there is between white and black. And then in the color values, you'd be setting the chrominance. Well, you'd be setting the saturation to say like how vibrant the color is, and then the hue to say like which color it is. That would be a setting you use if like people look too green or too red. Like you adjust the hue to like make sure that they look like they have the proper skin tone. So these like where I work, and typically in analog digitization, these 4 values are calibrated like per tape using color bars or skin tone to get it right. So one area where you can use QC tools is to verify that those settings were handled correctly. And then the other area is just trying to make sure that the the deck and the playback of the tape were as in good a condition as they could have been. So you'd be able to find, you know, the kind of glitches we saw, like head clogging, the white speckling pattern, vertical line repetition, you know, just like various indicators that your tape might need more treatment or your deck might need more cleaning to redo the error. But yeah, that's QC Tools. It's open source. You just download it. It was created under 2 National Endowment for Humanities grants, and like just recently there was like some additional funding, so there should be another release of QC Tools out before the end of the year that like updates the player and adds in some audio potentially.
You're also going to update the documentation?
Oh yeah, gotta catch up on the documentation too. That's like the part people always want to fund, you know, like. But yeah, obviously, like a lot of the documentation for the player is going to have to get so rewritten. QC Tools is built upon other open source projects, most specifically FFmpeg. So often, like the progress of those underlying projects, like leads to benefits within the main project, but then it also makes the documentation more out of date. Like Kevin noticed earlier, like it used to be QC Tools would just process everything as if it was 8-bit. They have 8-bit ranges, but now it processes it at the bit range that the video happens to start in. All right, so that's QC Tools. If you guys have any more questions or want to see anything in particular, that would be a good time for questions. Else, the next thing I'm going to transition to is a different project where it's going to be like going over like the significant characteristics of a video file, including its like container and codecs. But anything on QC Tools while we're still here? Oh, you guys, it's 5 o'clock. All right, cool. So the other DMG file we have in your USB key is called MediaConch. So double click on that. Mine's verifying the embedded checksum. So MediaConch is this little colorful shell looking guy. And then can I see hands like who's heard of like the program called Media Info before? All right, like everybody on the right side of the table has heard about it. So Media Info is it's a program that is made to make a very simple technical report of a file to report on its characteristics. So it has a very standardized vocabulary of characteristics for audiovisual data, like aspect ratio, the frame size, the frame rate, the container, the format. And Media Info is trying to like identify what all those characteristics are, even though the videos that are run through that tool are very diverse. So like if you have a collection of video files that has like a QuickTime file and an AVI and a Matroska and an MXF file, the way those files store information such as the frame size or the aspect ratio or the color information is quite different. But Media Info is guided to try to normalize that vocabulary to present it all under the same terms. So when you open up MediaConch, you'll get something like this. I have a bunch of files in here already because like I'm already. Let's delete these so I'm starting fresh like you guys. So, so I'm going to drag in the Born Digital file. It'll say it's in a queue, and then it'll show that it's analyzed. So when you drag in files, like you can drag in multiple if you like. Drag in this one too. It'll just kind of make this little list here. So first up, we're going to look at the reports in the column called Media Info. There's 2 icons in the Media Info column. There's one that's like an eyeball to like see the report, and then there's like a download one to download the XML of that report. So we're gonna hit the eyeball looking one. And then you'll get a report that looks like this that pops up. So this is a Media Info report just kind of presented in this graphical user interface. Like for those who've used Media Info before, you're probably more used to the command line version where you type on the terminal Media Info and drag in a file and you'll get like a report with the same data. This is just kind of presenting it in a graphical user interface where you can either review it as is or download the XML. So with audio-visual files, like there's generally like 2 significant levels of technology involved. One is what the container is, And that's often identified by what the extension is, like it's .mov, .avi. That container is going to be used to encapsulate different encodings that are all kind of collaborated together into a presentation. So like a AVI or a QuickTime file might contain like a ProRes video encoding or an H.264 encoding, and then like an audio encoding. And it could contain other types of information too, like subtitles, timecode track, whatever types of embedded information. Those are the ones I'm thinking of right now. Attachments. So in media info, the information is going to be organized into like one section about the file format as a whole, like the container, and that's presented at the top in a section called General. So the file I dragged in, it's an MPEG-4 file. It says that the format's MPEG-4, and it tells me a little bit of information about the size, the bit depth. This file has some metadata inside it that tells me the writing application. And then basically there's one subsection under this per type of data embedded into that container. So in this file, there's this video section right here. And let's see, then I have an audio section and an other section because I have a timecode track. So in the video section, it's going to give me like those significant properties I was talking about. It's going to tell me the size, the aspect ratio, the frame rate, the color space, the bit depth, all the kind of most pertinent information about the qualities of this type of file. And then the next section, it's going to give me the audio information, and then the timecode information as well. So this information is very important to manage and gather in an audiovisual collection. Like, I'd kind of say, like, if you're handling an audiovisual videotape collection and you have an assortment of tapes like U-matic tape and Betacam tape, like, it's very important to know like what formats you're managing so that you can prioritize your preservation approach and make sure that you're maintaining the hardware that you need to be able to access that collection. So if you have like 6,000 U-matic tapes, like, you need to make sure that you're maintaining enough U-matic players to actually present that information back so that you can reformat it. The same kind of approach applies to digital video. If you have a collection that has like ProRes and H.264 and DV and MPEG-2 and DVDs, like, you need to make sure that you know how to handle that material and how to potentially reformat it to another format later. So whereas like the videotape equivalent, like, that involves like doing a lot of inventories, like looking through boxes, putting barcodes on things, like identifying what tapes are and tallying them in your database. The digital files, you can automate a lot of that inspection work by having a tool like MediaInfo do it, create an XML or gather data that can then go into a database or into a summary report. So like sometimes like at CUNY, when we're dealing with like an incoming digital collection where we don't know too much about it, it's just like a big mess of like production files in a directory. Like, we'll make a script to like scan through the files, run them all through MediaInfo, and then to summarize it against some of these key properties. So we'll know, for instance, like what video codecs are going to be involved in this and like what types of containers, just like how similar or diverse are the technical dependencies of this collection so that we can be sure that we're able to play it. I mean, related to this, I remember like when I just started working at the City University of New York, I was very familiar with using this project FFmpeg for handling audiovisual data. FFmpeg is kind of what QC Tools is based on for gathering all that information and presenting the video. FFmpeg is an open source project that handles audiovisual processing or converting like one type of audiovisual data to another. And probably like most of the video we see like online or streaming has been processed with FFmpeg in some way. It's just like a really ubiquitous everywhere open source project for handling audiovisual data. But when I started in my current job at CUNY, which was like in 2011, I was very accustomed to using FFmpeg, but they were using like Apple ProRes video codec everywhere. And then I was like really discouraged or worried. I was like, how am I gonna work with this collection? Because it was a proprietary Apple codec. And to get a FFmpeg wasn't able to work with this format at all at the time. And in order to get a ProRes codec at the time, I think the only way to get it was to buy like Final Cut Studio for like $1,000. And then in the installer disk, there was like a ProRes decoder that like went into your Mac, so then you could play it. So it made it so that like most Mac computers out of the box and most computers just like couldn't work with it unless you bought this like expensive proprietary software. So in some ways that makes it a risk, like when you're dependent on like one company to get access to a particular collection. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent risk with every single videotape format. Like if I want to play a U-matic videotape, I'm somewhat dependent on like the Sony company that makes the decks, even though they stopped making them altogether. And I'm dependent on like, you know, the weird little reseller market and like more informal network of like those trying to make up for Sony not supporting that format anymore. But with ProRes, it was like, it did feel like a bit of a risk. Like this codec is fully dependent on one player, like one company's player, and it's expensive, it's hard to access. So it would kind of like, it, you know, so it did increase the risk of this collection a little bit. But then like a couple of weeks after I started working there, like a developer like ended up, you know, finishing his work to reverse engineer the ProRes encoding to make like an alternate open source ProRes decoder, and then contributed that to the FFmpeg project. So before I even like, you know, kind of finished developing workflows, like FFmpeg like included like a ProRes decoder, and I think now it might have 2 or 3 like different ProRes decoders. It definitely affects the standing of how risky or obsolete a video encoding might be based on like how many different implementations are existing. So going from like, you know, just having like one Apple corporation provide like all the, you know, have like a monopoly of the tools to access this encoding, to going to a situation where now like that company is still supporting it and still defining it, but also there's now multiple like open source tools that can do the same work. Like that makes a big impression on like what the sustainability of this format is. You know, because now we're not like dependent on a proprietary system, and we're not like, you know, beholden. We can, you know, in some ways, like when audiovisual data is correctly interpreted by open source software, it helps, you know, reduce a lot of anxiety about maintaining that format, because we know we can just like work to maintain that software and make sure it's operational. But, you know, it's not going to be like it is with videotapes, where a company just stops selling the decks altogether, and then we're stuck. Like I remember, for instance, like the VLC player, like VLC, like I think they reached like 3 billion downloads recently, which is like a lot of copies of a player. I doubt there were ever that many like video decks ever, like for, I don't know, I wonder if like Sony ever tallied up like how many U-matic decks they ever made. Maybe a couple tens of thousands, but I doubt it was anywhere near 3 billion. At any rate, for like I mean, for WGBH is probably true too. Like it's a big mix of like both digital and videotape materials. And like there does require some planning on like how to reformat digital formats, but it does feel like if a format is stuck on a videotape, it's like by far a greater priority than any of the digital files we have and what their reformatting issues are. So when we look over the whole of our collection and we see what the risks are, it's pretty much if it's on a videotape, it's a risk and we need to move that material off. We can prioritize that in a certain order to be like U-matics first, and then we'll get to like the digibetas a bit later. And then there's kind of like a big gap of worry, and then like, you know, digital files. I don't know, are you guys at WGBH doing any digital file reformatting?
No, but it's something to think about, because we do have a lot of proprietary file formats in the archive. Our producers go out and shoot on every kind of camera made, and the cameras they bought in 2006 and 2008 and 2010, and they're shooting all kinds of raw video, and we know that we're not going to be able to play all those formats back in 10 years. And right now we just don't have the bandwidth to start worrying about those, but it is somewhat, it keeps me up at night. Probably as much as the U-matics, because I know we're dealing with the U-matics now. Something else I will say about you know, the sort of open source versions of decoders and encoders of proprietary software. It's awesome to have them, and it's really important. And it means that, you know, these files that might not be accessible if you have a tool like FFmpeg are potentially going to be accessible. It can be viewed and played back and transcoded into another format. But if one of the things that you're concerned about is fixity of your file, making sure that you have the exact same file. Does everyone here know what a checksum is? Which is the thing that tells you if your file is exactly the same. If you have something that's encoded in a proprietary codec, and then you transcode it to something else. So, you know, you make a derivative over, then you try and get that original file back by using an open source variant on that codec. You might not be able to get the exact same file. You're going to get an equivalent that probably has all of the same salient characteristics and might be just as effective for your purposes, but it is not going to be that original file. So if what you're worried about is just the fixity of that file, then that's going to be a cause for concern. If what you're worried about is the salient characteristics, there are other ways to check whether what you're really capturing the same essence of that video, even if it's not the exact same file. So there's ways to like look at a frame of a video and say, all right, is this frame visually the same, even if the file, the actual order of the bits and bytes isn't the same? And that can be a really useful tool when you're moving from a proprietary codec into open source codec, and you want to check that your transcode is okay and you're still retaining the important characteristics. You can look at things like bit depth and other technical characteristics at duration, at what your color space is, and see if those things are the same, even if the file isn't exactly the same. That's some of the stuff that you can think about with digital files when you're thinking about reformatting for the future in some of the same way that you think about moving from analog to digital for the future.
So we'll do a little more and then we'll be done. Or I can take questions and then be done. So I was showing off like media info report and kind of talking about why it's important to document the particular characteristics you have of your collection, just so you can verify that you have the ability to sustain the collection of such characteristics. And like I said earlier, so media info groups together information about the container in one place, and then about each type of data that's encapsulated within it, and provides characteristics about those individual parts. Because an audiovisual container is going to, combine different types of data that are for different purposes, like to create images or provide audio or text. So the media info report is reporting on the file from a perspective of like coming up with a key set of characteristics and trying to fulfill the value for every one of those characteristics that it can. So from here, I want to show you an alternate type of report called media trace. And so when I click on the eye for that, it's going to show a very different looking report. It's not going to be nearly as readable as where we were coming from. But what this report does is it basically goes byte through the file and documents the semantics of every part of the file, particularly the parts of the file that aren't audiovisual data. So I just opened up an MP4 file in this, and I can see a couple of sections where it says there's a couple of folders here called track, track, and track. These correspond to the 3 tracks of the file. There's one video track and an audio track and a timecode track. So if I delve into these, let me see. I'll find a particular area that's interesting. Yeah, there's so much to dig around in. Oh, here we go. Sample description, video. So I don't know if this shows too well on the projection here, but like delving into the, this allows you to like delve into an MPEG-4 file or AVI or Matroska file as if it's like an XML where all the parts are labeled. Like in the actual file as it's stored, there's not the labeling associated with it, but like what MediaConch is doing in this media trace report is it's dissecting the file into all of its components and labeling and arranging them in a hierarchical report like this. So when I go into the video node, I can see information about like the width and the height. This is 720 by 486. And then I can see the specific offset, like how many bytes into the file is that data actually positioned. So if I had to, if I had to drill into this file in like a hexadecimal editor or make a minor change to it, this would help be a guide between like what raw data is actually in the file and what the semantics of it are. Like what is the meaning of the individual pieces of data in the file. So like reading through this, it often correlates directly to the specifications. So like if you looked at Apple's specifications for QuickTime or ISO's specifications for MPEG-4, it would use the same vocabulary you see presented here. So as I said, like normally this is intended to be as human readable as a media info report is, where it's giving you more digestible labeling and values. But this really lets you diagnose and get into the details of a file in a way that you can't with the more simple reports. So I guess like one example of why we would use this is there ends up being in archives a lot of situations where you have two files that seem very similar, but they act differently. Like one will work in an application and the other won't. And when you look in media info, the details tend to be roughly the same, and like what you would expect them to be the same, but often you have to like drill in to find like where they diverge more specifically. So some of the more advanced diagnoses can come from a report like this. So those are the two types of reporting that MediaConch does. It does media info, giving you like this kind of generic characteristic report, and MediaConch, or media trace, which is really just drilling into the whole architecture and labeling everything about it.
Do you know when you build a policy using the MediaConch GUI and the drop down for building the policies?
Oh, Kevin, you're like way ahead. I was just gonna get to that. All right, so like Kevin was saying here, sometimes the results of what is in this report would affect workflow. Like we were talking about this a bit at WGBH earlier, but you know, like sometimes like you'd be like, okay, these U-matic tapes when they're digitized should be like 2-channel audio, but these digibeta tapes when they're digitized should be 8 channels of audio. You know, or different characteristics of the file should verify based on what that file is coming from or what workflow it's coming out of. So MediaConch has a way to define policies for like what data you would expect to be in these reports. So this is intended, like if you're taking audiovisual tapes and you're giving them to a vendor and you're like, I want you guys to do a really great job taking these tapes and digitizing them to files that have these characteristics. The policy side of MediaConch is that you can take those characteristics and define them in a policy and then apply that to files. So your policy can be something like, I expect all these to be like, you know, QuickTime files that use the ProRes codec. And then you can enact that as a policy and see like what passes and what fails. So from here, I'll go over to the policies tab, and it has a couple of policies like baked into this. There's also a public policies tab where if I was online, it would connect. Oh, I am online. I got like on the Wi-Fi here. Oh, maybe Lily did that. Somebody got me online. So like the public policies section is like a place where people are sharing their MediaConch policies with the community. But like for now, we'll just use the policies that are baked in here. Let's see, one of these policies is called the CAVPP Preservation Master. This is based on the California Audiovisual Preservation Program or project. They would define specifications as to how they want their files to be digitized. So when I click on this, this will show me all the tests that certain files are going to be run through. Like this policy expects that the width of the video frame is 720, the height is 486. It gives frame rate, audio information. It's a pretty simple set of tests for this one, but they're all, you know, they're all enumerated here. So like one set of these characteristics might be what you communicate to the vendor to be like, I want you to digitize to these results. MediaConch is intended to be a place where you could take all those anticipations and express them into a policy. You know, so as I click on components of the policy, like the editor changes on the side, so you can like edit it or add different rules. So if I go back over to the checker part of it, there's a policy dropdown list that lists the policies in here. So I can say, I want to test against the CAVPP Preservation Master Policy, and then run check files. Or let's see, that's checking. Oh, I didn't actually. Oh wait, I want this drop down here to apply it to files I've already opened up. So CAVPP Preservation Master, it's going to run that against it, and then my files failed because in this case, these files aren't intended to match that preservation policy. But in the policy column where it's red because of the failure, I can click on the I and it'll open the policy report. And then this report is showing the result of applying that policy to that file. I can see that this file coincidentally passes a lot of those characteristics. It has the width, the height, the frame rate, the color and space information. But one of the tests is that the video should be interlaced, but it fails because this video is progressive. And the audio should be PCM, but here it's AAC. It's got the wrong bit depth, it's not QuickTime, and the video codec is different. You know, so if you gave your vendor specific instructions to be like, I want these files, and then you express that in a policy, when you get the files back, you should be able to drag them all in, apply a policy to them, and see that it passed everything. Or if it failed, you'd be able to drill in and see like why specifically it failed. So this is a very different approach to quality control than what we started with in QC tools. Like with QC tools, we're doing quality control of what is contained within the video, like what is represented in the imagery of the video. Like, is it too dark? Is the color wrong? Is it glitchy? Are there dropouts? QC tools is applying audiovisual metrics to every frame to kind of quantify those different issues. The media conch, it doesn't care about like what the video is of or the contents of it. It's mostly just looking at everything else about the video, the container, how the information is, how the container is describing the information within it, like these characteristics like which height, frame rate, and everything like that. And then the report comes out kind of saying if it passed or failed. Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to, you use MDQC in a similar way. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Or
So we used MDQC because at the time we couldn't get MediaConch to work on our computers.
early, we weren't ready yet.
Yes, but now I've used both. And again, it's pretty similar. You set up your specifications for what kind of videos you want to pass your check. So say that you want to make sure that all of your master files are 10-bit, which is a thing that we talked about a little bit earlier. You want to make sure that they all have. If you know that the format you're coming from generally has 2 channels of audio, you can say I want to make sure that everything has 2 channels of audio. You can say, I want to make sure that they're all wrapped with not just H.264 or not just MXF, but with a certain flavor of that codec. And then it will, we'll use the media info report to do all the technical checks that it can and validate. And if something is a match, then you can go back to your vendor and say, hey, we understood that we were supposed to have 2 channels of audio and everything, but this thing has no channels of audio. Why are there 0 channels of audio? What happened here? It's a pretty good, it's a pretty quick way to check that at least the things that you're getting back are what you expect to be getting back, and that there hasn't been an issue in the final transcoding or anything like that. And it's also a good way, if you're transcoding a bunch of stuff yourself, you're trying to make a bunch of proxies, and you know that you need to hit certain specifications, like our website, for example, only accepts a very specific flavor of H.264 files, and there's a certain bit rate that we're supposed to have, and there's a certain frame size for everything that goes up on the website. That when we get proxies from other organizations or when we make them ourselves, like, okay, did we calibrate the script in the right way? Is this proxy video actually going to work on our website? And we can do that check as well.
Yeah, that's true. That's like one of the use cases for the policy section is like when you are trying to verify if a file is compatible with a particular system. Like if you want to make sure like a file is going to play back on your iPhone or a particular projection device, often they're like, we support these codecs, these characteristics, like, they provide these details in a way that can be translated into a report. So you can be like, do these files like all pass? Like, should we expect them to play on this system or not? Another policy I wanted to point out here, it's got a really catchy name. It's called the TN 2162 compliant policy. We haven't talked about like what formats you would choose in digitization too often, but for audiovisual digitization, there's like a kind of a short list of like preferred files to use for digitization. Like often it's like JPEG 2000 used with an MXF container, or FFV1 used with a Matroska container, or like uncompressed video used with AVI or QuickTime, or sometimes ProRes with QuickTime. Like there's a decent like list of different suitable options. But like when using uncompressed video, there's a bit of a risk associated with it because like uncompressed video has no ability to define its own encoding. Like if you have uncompressed video, it's not going to be able to say if it's interlaced or what the color data is really supposed to be like. It's fully dependent on the container to do that. Whereas like a more modern codec like ProRes will be like, I'm interlaced, this is my color data, you know, it'll give a lot of significant details about itself, you know, which helps make it very interoperable if you play it for different systems or if it's coming out of different containers. With uncompressed, it has nothing to say about itself. It's fully dependent on the container, and what container will be able to say about its encoding varies from like container to container. So
you remember the dense image coalition when it turned out that everything was being captured in AMIA with square pixels?
oops, you know, yeah, like so Apple, the Apple company like made this technical note called TN2162 to be like, here are the risks associated with using uncompressed video. Like it might look different in different places or be different shapes, like different aspect ratios. So it was like, if you're going to use uncompressed video in a QuickTime container, in addition to having a valid QuickTime file, these are all these additional steps you should be able to, you should meet to like have a well-formed uncompressed file. Because normally in a QuickTime file, like details like the aspect ratio or the color would be optional to put in the container, because typically the audiovisual encoding inside would say that about itself. So TN2162 is providing all these additional rules about like what an uncompressed QuickTime file needs to say about itself. I don't have any uncompressed QuickTime files in the sample set because we just needed small files, but I did apply the policy to the MP4s I had here. Oh, I passed one and I failed everything else. That's fine. But this basically details out all the tests for like storage of color information, interlacement information, aspect ratio, like because if the container didn't say this type of detail, then it would be guesswork. Like you'd have an uncompressed video in QuickTime, but if it doesn't say what the interlacement is or the aspect ratio it is, it has to like presume a lot of these characteristics in order to play it back. So you might get video that's in the wrong shape or being presented as progressive when it's supposed to be interlaced. I think that, like aspect ratio is probably the most common like interoperability issue, because like you'll have like uncompressed in QuickTime, but neither the container or the video encoding itself will have anything to say about its aspect ratio, like the dimensions of width over height. So it'll just present as if all the pixels are intended to be square, when that's like almost never the case with data coming from analog media. So, you know, so this policy was like included in here as a sample because like uncompressed in QuickTime is still like a very prominent option for video digitization projects. But this is like a policy that's like intended to, you know, promote the additional requirements that are put onto this format by Apple in this case, just because like they're like the one organization putting a shout out for having like well self-describing files. All right, so that's my tour of MediaConch, and now we got like 10 minutes to like digest what we learned today. I don't know, I mostly you know, so just to recap, I showed off some of the issues that come up when you're setting up a digitization workflow, like setting up like the decks and the hardwares and everything. We went over QC tools and went through a lot of use cases of like what the results look like and how you can see that in the graph and how you can analyze them into the players to like kind of like have a more guided spot check of content as you're reviewing. And then we used MediaConch to look at different ways to like report on the characteristics of a file and create policies to test those characteristics against your expectations. And that's like a, you know, 2-hour, 45-minute workshop, and I'm tired, but yeah, I got questions. If you guys have questions, I'm willing to chat and be friendly. I'm not exactly sure like how in depth like audio visual preservation instruction gets at Simmons. So if you guys like already know all this stuff, like you should have told me earlier. But if you guys have any other, yeah, questions or complaints or just like what up.
Terminology we use that you want to, you know, that like if we want, you know, they were fast. I know I threw in some introduction.
Rebecca talks fast too. She's not presenting right now, so it's not as prominent. But I've seen like a lot of Rebecca presentations.
So, but if there's any stuff that like that got touched on along the way that you guys have questions about, and you want to kind of rewind a little bit and ask about, feel free.
I have a question.
Yeah, thank you.
So if I get tapes back from my vendor, like I have UMAG tapes that came back from a vendor, I don't have a UMAG deck, so I don't have any way to watch them.
Yeah.
What are some ways that I can know if they just like really look that bad, or if it was like a bad digitization job?
Is this like something you're imagining, or did this really happen to
This
you?
really happened. I mean, it's
not
what
like
they are,
asking
it's
for a
possible
friend.
me They look that bad, but I don't know sort of what to use to make an assessment.
I mean, one thing is like pneumatic tapes always look bad, you know. Like
They don't look that bad. Sometimes you can get a really nice capture off pneumatic tape. One thing to do when you catch stuff that's an issue, if you're looking at something you're like, I think this is an issue with tape, but I don't know. There are resources out there like the AV Artifact Atlas. AV Artifact Atlas is a really good one if you're not familiar with it. And it can be worthwhile just sometimes to check on what you think the issue is and to see whether it's something that's more likely to be associated with the deck or with the tape. Another way is Dave was talking about, when running tools, the kind of errors that can be introduced by a transfer versus the kind of errors that are like innate to a tape. So stuff like the color looks out of whack, or the brights are really white and the darks are really dark. That's the kind of stuff that can definitely be fixed by settings. Stuff like, there's a bunch of big, head clogs or like video looking errors. That may be something that's innate to the tape. It may be something that a tape is going to have to like get cleaned to do, but it's something that's probably going to be a little harder to fix than just we need to readjust the settings. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like I would view it with the waveform monitor, because you'd like, for instance, if like you can see there's some pretty bright parts here, like this light, and if you saw that there was a bunch of data lit up above or below these like boundary lines at 16 and 23, you'd know, like, the video is digitized too dark or too white. I mean, it might just look like, if you have a gist of it, like this video looks too dark, or there's like big black splotches in it, it might be digitized like just way too dark. And if you brightened it up, you'd get a lot more detail out of it. I mean, the same with the color. Like if it looks too black and white, like if the color is just like too dim or something, then you'd be able to say back, like, if you made some adjustments, this would look way better, but it sucks the way it is. There's one tool in here called there's Luma Adjust and Chroma Adjust, where you can like adjust these like after the fact, to kind of fake it. So like if your video looked like this on the left, you'd be like, that's not what it's supposed to look like. If you can make some adjustments here and make the video look a lot better, like here's like going the wrong way, too dark, then you'd know there's something you could do. The same thing with chroma adjustment here. Like if I adjust the hue, like you can see like all the colors change. Like the person who's digitizing has a knob where they're setting this color. So hopefully like right at the default in the middle is what looks good. But if you can make it look better by switching it one way, then you'd know, like, the person in the room calibrating that tape should have also realized that you could make it better if they just turned the knob a bit. I mean, here I'm manipulating the video after the fact. It's best to do that manipulation while it's still in its analog form and you're digitizing. There's a button here like to overlay the vector scope. So like as I like move the hue, you can see like the vector scope image kind of like rotating. Like this is what they would see on their vector scope. So QC Tools does give you like a little bit of way to like reverse engineer their calibration process. And yeah, if you made it look significantly better with like tweaking some of this stuff after the fact, then you'd know it would look better if they tweaked it before the fact too.
Something to sometimes look out for, especially depending on your content. I don't know what kind of content it is that you or your friends are working with. But a lot of video content will have color bars at the beginning, and that's what vendor software will use to set their levels. But depending on the kind of content it is, the color bars might have nothing to do with the actual content of the video, because there are a lot of people, artists, amateur video makers, whatever, who would be like, oh, well, I know I'm supposed to throw some color bars on the front of this, so I'm just going to put some color bars on without necessarily adjusting them to make sure that they actually reflected the light color content of the video. We actually just had a case with this with a digitization project with the partner that we're working on. And they were getting the video files back and they didn't look properly calibrated. The whites and the darks were really blown out. And the vendor said, well, we're setting to the color bars. And the folks who were sending had the tapes. that, yeah, but the color bars don't have anything to do with the video. You're going to have to actually make adjustments and like look at the content because you can't trust the color bars to actually tell you what's going on in there. So that's sometimes, especially if you're working with amateur, like non-broadcast video content, that's definitely something to look out for and something to talk with the vendor about.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of times in the absence of color bars or when color bars aren't trustworthy, like it's best to use like skin tone because like the pigment of skin tone is generally consistent. I mean, like, you know, you can, if I went to chroma adjust, let's see. You know, if I go like a little bit one way, like you can see like she's like inappropriately red. And if you go the other way, it's like, well, oh man, she's like really sick. She needs help. You know, like the eye can kind of catch that with skin tone pretty easily. I remember like we had this one too. Oh, it's like the Open Mind. I think you have this series too, where like Richard Hefner, like we have all these tapes and the color bars weren't reliable, and we were just digitizing like a bunch of these episodes of Open Mind, and I just remembered them being recorded. But he like we would try to set to his skin tone at the beginning, but then we realized like I think he like tans or something, or like his skin tone changes over time. So like when you watch a winter episode or a summer episode, you get different colors. So we use the guest instead. Like
I mean, it's all, you know, setting the colors is not like there's no way to, if you don't have accurate color bars, there's no like exact science for it. But a vendor should have enough experience to be able to say, well, we're pretty sure that we can get a good image off of this. Is it mostly like color light issues that you've been seeing, or is it not?
A lot of it's black and white, and it's a lot of bright to dark, and it's like amateur like graduation video. So I feel like it could just not be great video.
Definitely also possible.
But I just wasn't sure how to like assess that without being able to like play it myself or like look at it on something else.
Something else you can look at is sometimes you can tell if a video file's been dubbed a lot, because the more a video file is dubbed, the worse it's going to look. So if what you've got is a copy of a copy of a copy, it's going to look kind of gross. And you can know that it's just because it's a copy of a copy of a copy. It's never going to look as good as the original. On some videos, there are these things called scan lines at the bottom, and they tell you how often, every time a video is dubbed from an older video, you add another scan line to that. So if there's a bunch of scan lines at the bottom, it probably means that it was.
Hey, wouldn't they just like overwrite each other? Like it's not like the video is like scooting up. Like wouldn't the scan lines just like overwrite at some point? I doubt you'd be able to get it to go up very high.
You can't get it to go very high, but it does get like after like 10 dubs, you do get a higher amount of scan. It is like rings up an oak tree a little bit.
Nice.
I know VHS does it. I don't know if Humatic does it effectively, but with VHS for sure, like you can count them going up.
Got any other questions in the room? Everyone else great? Yeah.
We're developing specs for a statement of work with a vendor for unconfessed time, guaranteeing 62.
Yeah, I suspect like George Blood's probably heard a client that him say that to him.
They won't be able to fulfill that. The vendors, I've worked with multiple vendors, and my experience is that the current commercial software will not comply with TN 2162, and you're going to have to make a decision about what to do about it.
It's good to have an awareness on why it doesn't, though. Like if they say no, they should at least be able to say like what's missing, so you have an idea of what the risk is. Like the more knowledge and control you have over the process, the better. So even if you're not exactly hitting a specification, as long as you know what the compromise is, well, it's a lot better than just being like, I want quick times, and then when they come back being like, great, like happens in a lot of cases.
Yeah, exactly. You need to know why, for example, vendors are adopting a software, the movie recorder, Softron movie recorder.
Oh yeah, I've used that.
And they don't create a color app, which is key. Part of Team 2162. So educate yourself before you go to the vendor, because the vendor doesn't meet your specifications and you don't know, what the specifications are all about. You don't have you won't be able to tell them what to do.
I mean, I'll say like 20, I don't think TN 29/21/62 is the perfect document or standard like for us to adopt. Like it is nice that like Apple acknowledged this, this issue, this vulnerability of using uncompressed in their particular container. But like there's some things like I think like it does mandate like the color atom is there, the interlacement atom is there, but like then it doesn't mandate the aspect ratio atom. Like, so if it's not there, then it's just assumed all the pixels are square. And I wish they just said like, oh, it should be there, and it just say if the pixels are square, rather than not saying anything at all. You know, so like I feel like the archival community could produce something better than that, but it's just like, you know, time permitting, you know, we'll just use this for now because somebody actually wrote it down on the web.
Yeah, it's true. TN21, you can have TN2162 compliant files that are really seriously screwed up. Yeah, the pixel aspect ratio, for example, could be wrong, and TN2162 doesn't about that at all. So again, more in-house understanding of the issue.
Cool. Does everyone know, just to rewind a little bit, does everyone know about the different aspect ratios for a video file?
It's just the ratio of the width versus the height.
But then like within that, there's the pixels have a certain aspect ratio, and that can change the aspect ratio, the display aspect ratio of the video as a whole.
Oh man, like Rebecca, we only got 40 seconds left. We can't get one more quick question? All right.
I've gotten some older digital QuickTime files, and some of them aren't Apple's specification, and some of the original Apple specification.
Right.
I've accepted them, and I don't know if I should run into space with that.
Well, the thing is like so Apple made a format called QuickTime, and it was just like a proprietary container format that they developed, and that's what's called by MediaInfo original Apple specifications, QuickTime. And then in I think around like 2004 or so, like ISO, the standards organization, was making a container format that's basically the MP4 family of containers, and they use Apple QuickTime as a basis for that. So when that standard was released, then Apple decided to make a profile of that standard named QuickTime. So there's technically like two different formats called QuickTime. One is the original Apple proprietary specification, and one is a profile of an ISO container format. In practice, they're very similar, but they have different mandates, requirements, constraints. So there is a little bit of variety between them. So like when you're seeing that you have QuickTime files and some are MPEG-4 and some are original Apple specification, it does kind of indicate the age at which the software you have was writing it, because Apple pretty much transitioned everything from 2005 onward so that it was using the newer one. But there were still some workflows where it lingers using the older one. Like if you use Final Cut Pro to capture tape using the log capture interface, it just always use the old original specification. So it's not like a big deal, but like, you know, they are different. You know, it is feasible you could find a player that worked with one and not the other, you know. In my practice, that hasn't been the case. Like, you know, if somebody was developing a reader for the newer format, they should be well enough aware that there's this earlier generation format that they might as well support too, because it's just so similar. No problem. All right, guys, thanks for coming. 6:01.
Applicable to everyone, and that is when questions like this arise, where can people go to get answers? Because I ask my questions on developer forums, on the AMIA list, on the Media Info discussion forum, on
There's the Media Info discussion forum?
yeah, there is. Yeah, it's on I won't say GitLab, but GitHub.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and very rarely do I get any kind of a response at all. And you know,
Maybe use more emojis. I don't know, you gotta maybe use more emojis. You gotta stand out, you know.
yeah, I mean, do you have a recommendation?
I don't know, like in some of these cases, like questions might be appealing to people contributing to an open source project. So in some ways, it's kind of depending on a volunteer answer in a way. but I don't know, the venues you were talking about seem good to me. I mean, I like prefer to communicate in GitHub, to have like a documentation of the answer. You know, so like sometimes somebody will write me an email privately about an open source project, and I'll just be like, well, can you put your question in here? I'd rather answer it to everybody rather than personally. Yeah, I don't know. All right. Thanks for coming to the workshop. Nice to have all you.